Hello and welcome to the Importance of Confidentiality in Adult Education. This is a resource for staff and volunteers, instructors and tutors who work in adult literacy, ELL, and GED programs. My name is Jamie Kobes. I'm a tutor training and digital literacy project manager for Wisconsin Literacy. In this video, I'm going to cover the types of personal information that you want to keep confidential. I'll give you some examples of formal confidentiality agreements that your agency should have. We'll have 8 best practices for maintaining confidentiality, and I will end with scenarios to check your understanding. Confidential information is information that we think of as personal. It includes names, addresses, and telephone numbers, social security numbers, but also citizenship status or immigration status, level of education, financial information including employment status or place of employment, any involvement with the justice system, marital status and sexual orientation, and medical information. This personal information could be information that you need to share internally on a need-to-know basis in order to best support your students or staff, but otherwise you want to keep this private. Most of the time we operate under an informal confidentiality agreement, meaning that information you share with students or that students share with you kind of comes with this unspoken agreement that will keep it confidential. But as an adult education agency, you really want to have formal confidentiality agreements in place. These could look like clauses in a volunteer or staff handbook, student intake forms, or norms that instructors and tutors set at the beginning of instruction. It's our hope that by watching this video, we can all start on the same page and acknowledge that confidentiality is an ethical responsibility that we have as adult educators, and that we're really doing it for our students, because guaranteeing adult students' privacy protects a safe learning environment. On the next slides, I've gathered 8 best practices for maintaining confidentiality. Best practice number 1. We want to remember that our students are adults who can make their own decisions, and one way to show our respect for our students is never to assume what they would want. So best practice number 1, you want to involve your students in your confidentiality decisions. Whenever possible, you want to be able to discuss with your students the next 7 best practices and what they would like. Best practice number 2, avoid referring to students by name or other identifying characteristics, such as where they work, live, etc., when you talk about them. You can share specifics about instruction, but for example, you would want to say, my student is having difficulty reading a manual from work. Not, my student John is having difficulty reading the assembly line manual at the Ford plant. This best practice includes when you're talking about your students to other students or to the public, but it might not include talking about your student to other staff in your agency who would need this personal information to best support that student. Best practice number 3, store documents with personal information in a secure location. Shred those paper documents when you don't need them anymore. This includes records such as learner files, tutoring reports, stories students write, but it can also include just a quickly jotted phone number of your student that you've left on a sticky note. So you want to make sure that you don't leave those on your desk, that you don't leave student documents at a photocopier. You also want to remember that there might be legal guidelines about how long agencies have to hold on to student files, so you might have to wait a while before shredding those documents. Best practice number 4. For in-person tutoring, make sure your public meeting place has options for privacy. Again, this is a conversation you want to have with the student beforehand. Maybe they're okay sitting out in the open in a public library, for example, but you do want to offer the option of a closed door space. Best practice number 5, for online tutoring, wear earbuds or headphones and/or work in a private space. This is especially important if you have other people in your home or work office that could overhear your students speaking. We want to be sure that the student can be confident knowing that nobody is listening to them. You might also consider, if you have other students or maybe library patrons working behind you in a computer lab or something like that, you might also consider blurring your background with your camera setting. Best practice number 6, ask for explicit written permission to take and use photos and videos of students. As part of your intake process, your agency should have already asked and recorded this answer. You just want to make sure to inquire with your staff whether your student gave permission before taking or sharing photos and videos of them. A safe practice might also be just to get in the habit of taking pictures of the back of students' heads or from the back of a classroom. Best practice number 7. When you see a student in the community, let them take the lead on acknowledging you. Many students will love running into you and saying hello, but other students will not want to acknowledge needing the help. Let your students say hi first, and then also take their lead on explaining how they know you or how you know each other. So if your student says, "I'll see you at school tomorrow," then refer to your agency as school. Our last best practice number 8, tell students clearly when and where you cannot guarantee confidentiality. This might be at large public events or settings or times when you know that the media will be present. It might also be because a student has a criminal background and you want to share that criminal record with a tutor or instructor to make sure that that tutor or instructor feels safe and supported. All right, we've come to the section of scenarios to check your understanding. So we'll have 5 scenarios. Each scenario will be paired with a recommended response. But before you get to that recommended response, I really encourage you to pause the video and reflect on your own response and try to answer these 2 questions in italics for each scenario. To what extent is the student's personal information at risk? And which best practices would you use to maintain the student's confidentiality? Scenario 1. You're a tutor and you run into a student at a community event. A friend asks, "How do you two know each other?" To what extent is the student's personal information at risk? And which best practices would you use to maintain confidentiality? Pause the video to reflect. Scenario 1, we want to remember that confidentiality preserves the dignity of adult students. This is a place where you want to let the student take the lead in explaining how you know each other. And whenever possible, when you first start instructing this student, you should discuss the scenario beforehand. So say, when we meet in public, when we run into each other at the grocery store, what should we say? What should we do? Scenario number 2, a student speaks at your program's volunteer recognition event. He's able to share how much his tutor has helped him and how much he's learned. And then a reporter asks to interview this student. To what extent is the student's personal information at risk? And which best practices would you use to maintain confidentiality? Pause the video to reflect. For scenario number 2, volunteer and donor recruitment efforts, things that all agencies need to do, can sometimes conflict with confidentiality agreements. So this is a situation where beforehand you would have wanted to let the student know that it might not be possible to guarantee his confidentiality, that there will be media present. It's also a scenario where you want to ask the student for permission to use their name, story, and photo. And maybe before introducing them to the reporter. So whether you've told them before the event or before they meet the reporter, you want to make sure that they understand that their information will be publicized. Scenario number 3. As the instructor of a workplace English class, you want students to practice sharing about themselves, their names, their families, where they live, or where they are from. To what extent is the student's personal information at risk, and which best practices would you use to maintain confidentiality? Pause the video to reflect. In scenario number 3, we really want to remember that asking students to share personal information with peers or coworkers may break confidentiality. If this is a workplace English class, you want to check first with human resources about their policies. This could also be a scenario where you want to make sure to create class norms for maintaining privacy. So as the instructor, you start out class 1 by discussing what is it that we can share, what do we not share, and when things are shared, that they need to stay in this class. A workaround that one of our members did use in this actual scenario was to have students create alternate personas. Scenario number 4. Someone calls your agency to see if a student is present in your classes. To what extent is the student's personal information at risk, and which best practices would you use to maintain confidentiality? Pause the video to reflect. Scenario number 4 is really about remembering that confidentiality can keep our students safe. In the case of female students, it's important to remember as well that there is a statistical link between low literacy skills and abused women. In this scenario, you want to start out by asking students at the beginning, when you're offering services to them at the beginning, who has their permission to know that they are receiving your services. And that way you'll have a list of people that you can or cannot tell that they are present in your classes when they call. Our last scenario, scenario number 5. A student asks you, her tutor, for help installing an app on her smartphone. To what extent is the student's personal information at risk, and which best practices would you use to maintain confidentiality? Pause the video. In scenario number 5, we want to remember that students' personal devices like phones, tablets, laptops contain a lot of personal information. Not only is it a best practice for maintaining confidentiality, but it's a best practice for digital literacy instruction to have that student install the app herself with your verbal assistance. If you have to take possession of the device, make sure that you have the explicit permission of the student and that they watch as you install. So we've come to the end of this video, and I want to summarize. Confidentiality is important because it prevents misuse of personal information, either illegal or unethical use. It protects the reputation of the adult education agency. It builds trust and promotes students' confidence, and it protects students' dignity and safety. As much as we try, we know that this video can't be all-encompassing. So if after watching you want to discuss other scenarios that it made you think of, if you'd like to see example templates for some formal confidentiality agreements, I encourage you to reach out to us for more information at Wisconsin Literacy. You can also email me directly, jamie@wisconsinliteracy.org, JAMIE.